What a privilege we have this morning to hear from the Reverend Shari Prestermon, the conference minister for our Minnesota Conference, United Church of Christ. Shari has been in that role just slightly shorter than I have been here. She started just a couple of months after I did. Before that, she was the executive director of Back Bay Mission in Biloxi, Mississippi, for 13 years, I believe, in that role. Of course, she was there when Hurricane Katrina and all of that crisis and disaster struck. So she is a veteran of much important work on our behalf in the United Church of Christ. The Back Bay Mission is a UCC-related mission down there. And we're so grateful that you wanted to come and be with us, to come and bring a good word, to share with us a little of the life of the wider church, and to remind us that we are connected. So please welcome Reverend Shari Prestermon this morning.
Good morning. You get the gold star this morning, or the smiley face, or something for coming out on what I was told driving in is the coldest day in the Twin Cities in 2 years. You didn't know that, or you might have stayed home, huh? I'm glad you're here, and I'm grateful to be here at Mac Plymouth this morning. Thank you, Adam, for your invitation, and thank you for your ministry here at Mac Plymouth. You are so fortunate that you get to be part of two extended families of church, Presbyterian and United Church of Christ. And I'm here representing the United Church of Christ in Minnesota, as Adam said. You are part of a family that is 130 additional congregations across the state, with one in Iowa to boot, and part of a family that is 27,000 members of United Church of Christ congregations. So I represent your extended family on that side of your family today, and I'm glad to be with you. I always, and also just want to say an additional thank you to you, because I've noticed something about this church, and that is that you take seriously that wider relationship with your churches, and that part of that shows up in your giving. In our case, to our church's wider mission, but also to an ecumenical offering called One Great Hour of Sharing, where I was reminded this week that this church is in the top 100 congregations nationwide in terms of your per capita giving to One Great Hour of Sharing. That's pretty amazing. And those gifts go all around the world to help people who are in the worst kind of crises. I experienced that myself at Back Bay Mission when One Great Hour of Sharing gifts came to us, and I want to thank you for that. As well as your giving to the Tom and Monica Little Fund to try to get these two people within our conference to East Timor as global mission personnel. And your gifts have made it possible for me to say this morning that we have raised enough, and they are going to East Timor this spring. It's for you. Thank you. Thank you for being the church that you are. Our reading this morning comes from the prophet Isaiah in the Old Testament, the 62nd chapter, verses 1 through 7. For Zion's sake, I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest, until her vindication shines out like the dawn, and her salvation like a burning torch. The nations shall see your vindication, and all the kings your glory, and you shall be called by a new name that the mouth of the Lord will give. You shall be a crown of beauty in the hand of the Lord, and a royal diadem in the hand of your God. You shall no more be termed forsaken, and your land shall no more be termed desolate. But you shall be called, My delight is in her, and your land married. For the Lord delights in you, and your land shall be married. For as a young man marries a young woman, so shall your builder marry you. And as the bridegroom rejoices over the bride, so shall your God rejoice over you. Upon your walls, O Jerusalem, I have posted sentinels. All day and all night they shall never be silent. You who remind the Lord, take no rest, and give him no rest, until he establishes Jerusalem and makes it renowned throughout the earth. I forgot what I'm supposed to say after the reading, which I don't have in front of me. May these words be light and truth.
Good enough.
Okay. You're a flexible congregation, right? Pray with me, please. Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the thoughts of all our hearts gathered here be pleasing to you. Amen. Well, unbelievably to me, it was over 10 years ago now. I was living and working, as Adam said, in Biloxi, Mississippi, at a place called Back Bay Mission, a United Church of Christ ministry that had been serving there in Biloxi for 90 years, housing the homeless, feeding the hungry, advocating for justice. But on that searing August 2005 day in the thick of a Mississippi summer, everything changed. Hurricane Katrina swept through in the space of just a few awful hours, leaving nothing but destruction and ruin in her wake. Those days, months, and even years afterwards are ones I will never forget, and I hope never to relive. Unless you were there, and not just afterward to see what Katrina had done, but before, when life was normal and landscapes were beautiful, unless you were there, you cannot have imagined the impact of one day's waves and winds. Where once there'd been homes and neighborhoods and churches and places teeming with life and memory, now there was nothing. Deeply sacred places, historical places, beloved places, all erased from the earth in one single day. Returning to Biloxi after Katrina was returning to utter and mind-numbing desolation. The grief we experienced of so much and so many lost was profound. It was hard to comprehend how we would ever rebuild our beloved Gulf Coast, and yet doing that was what drove us and compelled us to carry on. Faith was sometimes a fragile but remarkably resilient thing in those days. Seeing signs of God's restorative presence in the midst of all of that ruin was often challenging, and yet God's promises of healing and new life remained our persevering hope. That is how it must have been for those that we encounter in today's passage from Isaiah. Because this was exactly the kind of moment that we find the people in this 62nd chapter. After 50 years of grueling exile, the people have returned to Jerusalem they so longed for, but it looked nothing like what they had left behind. Everything they looked at was completely desolate. The temple, the heart and soul of their community, had been destroyed. The walls, which had been their protection, ruined. The task of rebuilding was overwhelming, and in the midst of it all, God seemed distant at best. It is into this reality that we hear the bold proclamation of the prophet, who said, "For Zion's sake I will not keep silent, and for Jerusalem's sake I will not rest. No more shall you be forsaken, or your land called desolate." Isaiah, in this case, seems to be lifting a rally cry to the people, trying to pull them out of their profound grief and despair and pull them into the task of rebuilding. But Isaiah also seems here to be talking to God, putting God on notice that their prayers of petition would not end until their restoration was complete. This is the prophet at his best, summoning the imagination of God's people to see beyond the rubble all around them, calling forth a future that resembles more the hope to which God calls us. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whom we remember this weekend, fully embodied in his own life these very central prophetic tasks. He surveyed around him a different kind of ruin, the ruins of lives diminished by prejudice and bigotry, the destruction wrought by hatred and fear and violence. Like the bold prophets of our faith, he clearly named and called out the injustices of his time, and he unfailingly lifted his voice to cast a vision of what could be, what might be, what should be. He most famously and powerfully did this, of course, in the speech that we all think of when we think of Dr. King, that I Have a Dream speech that he delivered in 1963, standing in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. I have a dream, he said, that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed, that we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. I have a dream, he went on, that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. Refrain after refrain, this modern-day prophet painted a picture starkly different than the present-day reality he was in. But while these unscripted words that poured out from this pastor and prophet towards the end of that speech are the ones that we tend to remember, an earlier part of that same speech speaks equally powerfully to us today. He said, "We have also come to this hallowed spot to remind America of the fierce urgency of now. This is no time to engage in the luxury of cooling off or to take the tranquilizing drug of gradualism. Now is the time to make real the promise of democracy. Now is the time to rise from the dark and desolate valley of segregation to the sunlit path of racial justice. Now is the time to lift our nation from the quicksands of racial injustice to the solid rock of brotherhood. Now is the time to make justice a reality for all of God's children. Now is the time." Can you hear it? Can you hear the ways that his words, spoken 53 years ago in the height of the civil rights movement, have eerie relevance for us today? The old Jim Crow is gone, yes. But some would say a new Jim Crow of mass incarcerations among African American males has taken its place. In Ferguson and Baltimore and Cleveland and New York and the Twin Cities, new protests now rage. And while there haven't been dogs and fire hoses, there have been military tanks and riot gear. The deaths of those like Emmett Till and Medgar Evers and James Chaney defined a movement then. Today, it is those of Michael Brown, Trayvon Martin, Tamir Rice, Sandra Bland, and others. No matter how you judge these individual incidents and the public response to them, it must be clear to you, as it is to me, that issues of race are far from resolved in our nation. Racial injustice in our country today remains a bitter reality, and our debates and our actions regarding it are just as filled with anger, disagreement, and urgency now as they were in 1963. And that would be more than enough to confess, but it isn't all we must confront. An ugly rhetoric of hatred and fear also clutters our nation's discourse today when we speak of immigrants, Muslims, and a host of other issues. There is today, too, a palpable sense of this fierce urgency of now. But what does all that have to do with us here today at McAllister Plymouth? Or this morning at any of the other places where God's people gather to worship? If we feel it too, this fierce urgency of now, this moment in history so rife with division and anger and fear, then what are we to do? Some would say that the church of today, perhaps different than in the 1960s, has little moral authority to bring to bear on any of this. They say we no longer hold the same central place in society as church, that our voices in the church no longer have the kind of influence they once did, the kind of influence that can affect change in moral crisis. In his Christmas Day message last month, Pope Francis talked about the globalization of indifference and an impotent silence in the face of great suffering. And he seemed to suggest in that speech that the church is also guilty of this, as are others. Well, perhaps our prominence as church in U.S. society has indeed changed. Perhaps our voice has been diminished, or we have too often failed to raise it. But how we act as congregations, as the wider church, as individual Christians, still matters immensely. We have an obligation and a critical role to play as people who follow Christ to be present where the suffering is greatest, to question injustice, to heal what is broken around us. We are called to be prophets like Isaiah, with voices that refuse to be stilled and with a vision for our city, our nation, and our world that embraces love, not hate, unity, not division, and respect, not insult. While rampant fear may drive our nation's politics and occasionally clutch our own hearts, ours is a faith that is stubbornly anchored in hope. Ours is a faith grounded in a perfect love that casts out all fear. We have a voice that must be raised. We have a role, a critical role, in rebuilding the ruins around us. Now, what that looks like for every person and for every church will be different. Some will join the marches and the protests. Some will preach sermons or write letters. Others will seek understanding through dialogue and reading. And we must all examine ourselves in a spirit of confession to ensure that fear is not driving us, that love is our prayer and our way, that we're always building up rather than tearing down that beloved community which we seek. What you do and how you do it is up to you. It's up to your own hard, prayerful discernment in the spiritual work we engage in. There's a sign over the mantle in your room back here. What is that room called? The Plymouth Room. Of course it is. In the Plymouth Room, there's a sign that says, I think it says, everyone can do something. It's a quote of the Archbishop Oscar Romero. Everyone can do something. You can do something. Engage in your spiritual discernment to decide what that will be. But know this, each of us must embrace our role amid this fierce urgency of now. 4 years after Martin Luther King Jr. shared his dream in the shadow of the Lincoln Memorial, he would refer again to the urgency of the moment when he delivered a sermon entitled "Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break Silence." This is in part what he said. We are now faced with the fact that tomorrow is today. We are confronted with the fierce urgency of now. In this unfolding conundrum of life and history, there is such a thing as being too late. We must move past indecision to action. We must find new ways to speak for peace and justice. If we do not act, we shall surely be dragged down the long, dark, and shameful corridors of time reserved for those who possess power without compassion, might without morality, and strength without sight. Now let us begin he preached. Now let us rededicate ourselves to the long and bitter but beautiful struggle for a new world. This is the calling of the sons of God. The choice is ours. And though we might prefer it otherwise, we must choose in this crucial moment of urgency. Prophetic words, then and now. This is still the calling of the children of God. This is your calling and mine. Amen.